The fraud and criminality that exists in this country today is unprecedented. Probably in the history of all mankind, there has never been a time when there was such fraud and corruption that permeated every single aspect of our lives and society. Think about Wall Street and the banking sector. Just last week, the allegations about MF Holdings, $600 million just gone, 150,000 customer accounts frozen. What's most compelling about that is the lack of news or the lack of coverage by anyone, and that's just one example. Corzine was a former director at Goldman Sachs. But I guess the reason why it doesn't get much attention is that that's just the latest example in a long string of fraud and criminality and corruption and failures of the banking and financial system that we just have apparently become numb to. I will continue to pound on this one question, and that is, if any significant percentage of people ask to remove the cash that was allegedly in their investment accounts, their 401ks, would the financial system, the stock market, be able to turn those statements into real cash? I think any responsible and rational person would recognize that that could not happen. And so if you believe that, then you recognize that we're dealing with an absolute fiction. The same thing applies with the banking system. Assume that you have a bank account with a balance, alleged balance of $100,000, and then extrapolate that across the entire banking system. What if any significant portion of people walked up to their banks and asked to remove and turn that bank statement into actual cash? I think we all recognize that that just could not happen. It would cause absolute chaos and panic all across this country. Well, the fact of the matter is that we live in this time of extraordinary fraud and chaos because our elected and appointed leaders are corrupted at every single level, from the local level straight up to the White House. The fiction that we nursed as children and as young adults, that our democracy, our nation, our elected leaders served us, has now been diminished. And diminished is probably too weak a word. We need to understand that because our corporations own our government, our elected leaders are bought and sold. I heard a statistic that in all election campaigns, 95% of those who are elected are the person that raised the most amount of money. It gets even worse once they're in office because the bills that are passed, the legislation that is successful, is that legislation which is supported by the corporations. Now, behind me, you'll see all those law books back there. They're antiquated, they're old, and at the point in time when those books were printed, heck, maybe as even recently as the 90s, there might have been consumer protection legislation there, laws that would protect consumers and sort of even the playing field. But what's happened over, especially the last 10 years, but probably going back into 20 years, is that every one of those laws back there that existed to protect consumers has been chipped away by the corporations and the legislators that own them. It would be as if you just walked up to those law books back there, and if there was a page in there that had a protection for consumers, someone just went in and ripped it out. And successively, that's what happens in legislation. It happens with unfair and deceptive trade practices legislation, both at the federal level and at the state level. There's other legislation regarding unfair credit reporting and unfair collection practices, and all manner of consumer protection legislation. It was on the books, and in many ways it's still on the books in some cases. But what happens is, through successive amendments to the laws, that legislation gets watered down to where the law is weakened. And then it gets even worse in the courtrooms, because through judicial decisions, the laws that exist are weakened ever further. And so I deal with this every single day as I watch the devolution of consumer protection and see where a law that would seem like it would protect the consumer from, I don't know, maybe a bank kicking down the door, changing the locks, throwing your property out into the street, one would think that that would be against the law. One would think that if a bank comes and kicks down your door while you're at work and takes your property and changes your locks, especially when you're not even in foreclosure, that would be an act that, if it's not criminal, at least would carry with it some sort of civil penalty. But I can tell you, fighting these kind of cases and hearing about them every single day, that the banks feel emboldened that they are allowed to do that. And they are making the case all across this country that the banks have the right to kick down your door and change the locks and take your property out with no order of the court, with no legal right to do so. And one of the things that makes me so infuriated is that when law enforcement arrives, you, the homeowner, are put in the position of having to defend that this is your home or prove that it is your home. The banks are able to show up there with no paperwork, no order of a court, no legal authority to do so, and when law enforcement arrives, you, the homeowner, are forced to prove that it's your home. We flip-flop this. It's your home. And one of the foundations of this country is that we have a right to be safe and secure in our property from unreasonable searches and seizures. And when these banks are effectively arms of the federal government, and especially when they're operating under the guise of judicial process through foreclosure, they're acting as government agents. And if our government will not stand up and protect both the court system, the federal government, and the federal courts, then who will? Because certainly local law enforcement won't do it. This is one of the reasons why that's so important to me, and the rest of this country needs to understand that we can no longer, as citizens, allow this to continue. Our courts may be content to turn a blind eye towards this. Our legislators may be content to turn a blind eye towards this. And unfortunately, some of our local law enforcement may be content to turn a blind eye towards this. But we, as consumers and citizens, can no longer permit this to be happening. We need to be reaching out. We need to be speaking to the outrage of this, and we need to rely on the last best hope, I guess, of any sort of reclamation of our rights, and that is our press. When these sorts of things happen, the gross abuses of consumer rights, we need to be reaching out to press, sharing those stories, asking our reporters to report on it, and then when they hit the internet, when they hit the blogs, share the story with the world. Put it on Facebook and on your social media, because as we've seen with the Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movement in general, once people start to get involved at a very grassroots level, things change. I'm very, very concerned about where this country is heading right now, and frankly, I don't see much that's hopeful. But even in the face of that, it remains critically important that consumers and citizens band together to support one another in productive and constructive means. I think that if we are able to do so in the kind of organized and respectful way that much of the Occupy movement is characterized, then we may be able to take some of this back. We may be able to stand to protect us. But one thing's certain, if you don't get involved, every single one of you, in one way, no matter what it is, no matter what you do, if you don't get involved and stay involved on a daily basis, then all hope is lost. So it's up to every single one of you to find a way that you can remain involved, that you can do something to affect positive change. It may only be sending around Facebook stories. It may be sending around emails to friends and family. It may be discussing the import of these kind of stories with friends and families and those that are in your circle of influence and import. But whatever it is, you have an absolute obligation, every single citizen, every single person, to be telling the story and complaining and making sure that your voice is heard. Keep up the fight. I appreciate all your support, and I look forward to working with you.